Good morning, everyone. I'm Agustin Barrios Gomez. Welcome to ADN 40 News this Saturday, August 3rd. My colleague Ana Maria Salazar is off today. We're going to have 2 hours of news, just like we do every Saturday, from 8 to 9 in English and from 9 to 10 in Espanol. We're going to be talking with people from Bloomberg Business Week about what's been going on. We're going to have some really good interviews with respect to some of the highest ranking officials in the Canadian government about the new NAFTA, that is the USMCA. We're going to begin with local news. There are more updates related to the assassination of Daniela Ramirez. The Mexico City's Attorney General's office confirmed that the skeletal remains correspond to the young woman who disappeared back on the 19th. She boarded a taxi after finishing her shift, but then claimed by text message that her driver was trying to kidnap her. This and more is part of our weekly local news summary.
Osvaldo N., also known as El Chacorta, was arrested during a forced operation in Tabasco. He is the alleged leader of a criminal organization related to fuel theft, small-scale drug trafficking, kidnapping, and extortion at Chontalpa area. A federal judge issued an order to return Abigail González Valencia, also known as El Queenie, to Reclusorio Norte prison. He's a financial arm of the Jalisco Nueva Generación cartel. He will be transferred from Altiplanos prison in Almoloya de Juárez, State of Mexico, to avoid a possible escape. Esperanza Gutierrez is the only detainee related with the assassination of 2 Israelis at Plaza Arts Shopping Center. She was transferred from the female prison of Santa Marta Catitla to the Female Social Readaptation Center in Coatlán de Río Morelos. Besides, the Attorney General's office issued an Interpol notice to arrest Vanessa Bayer, the blonde woman who reserved a table in the restaurant where the shooting happened last week. 6 alleged members from the Los Rojos criminal group were detained. They are 4 adults and 2 minors. During the operation, police officers seized a shotgun, 2 guns, a revolver, and several doses of cocaine and marijuana. A pretrial detention order was issued against 12 alleged fuel thieves after clashes between Pemex personnel and members of the National Guard in Tepeaca, Puebla. Among the detained were Genaro N., also known as El General, Victor Manuel N., and other 10 partners in crime. They were all sent to the state's local prison. Guerrero's prosecutor's office confirmed the murder of journalist Rogelio Barragán. His body was found in the trunk of a car with injuries in the face and head. Meanwhile, the National Commission of Human Rights condemned the homicide, and with this recent incident, 9 journalists have been killed this year. 2 people died and 6 more were left injured during a shooting inside a restaurant located at a shopping mall in Zapopan, Jalisco. Among those present was María Luisa Aguirre de Echevarría, wife of the governor of Nayarit. Her bodyguards also shot back against the assailants. One of the killed was Martín Arzola Ortega, also known as El 53, alleged leaders of Los Deltas, a division of the Jalisco Nueva Generación cartel. El Chayan and 3 other of his accomplices were arrested at the neighborhood of Santa Cruz, Mellehualco in Mexico City. Police officers seized 2 kilograms of marijuana and 100 packs of cocaine. All the detainees were sent to the prosecutor's specialized office in small-scale drug trafficking. ADN 40 News.
And switching over to politics, Andrés Manuel López Obrador claimed that there isn't a resurgence of fuel theft and that it's actually decreasing. This and more is part of the president's weekly agenda. Let's take a look.
President Andrés Manuel López Obrador plans to make Mexico great again by freeing the country from the reliance of refined fuel imports. In fact, the president announced this week a starting debate for the controversial Dos Bocas refinery project. According to López Obrador and Mexico's Energy Secretary, Rocío Nale, preliminary work on the project began on August 1st at a cost of nearly $8 billion. The flagship infrastructure project aims to increase the production of gasoline and diesel to reduce imports, making the country fuel self-sufficient. Besides, according to AMLO, it will boost economic growth and development in the South, a region that has lagged behind the rest of the country for decades.
Ya inicia el trabajo de construcción de esta importante obra para producir en México las gasolinas y lograr el propósito de dejar de comprar las gasolinas en el extranjero.
Mexico's president has been harshly criticized over his support for a state law prohibiting protests. However, the president highlighted that this law is rather an anti-corruption reform that will never jeopardize the right to protest or any other basic human right.
Yo pienso que se estaba abusando, habían extorsiones, corrupción, y era necesario poner orden. Creo que ese fue el motivo principal de esta nueva legislación.
On Wednesday, López Obrador praised the country's economic performance. According to Mexico's statistical agency, INEGI, the country grew 0.1% during the second quarter of 2019.
Entonces, esta es una muy buena noticia. Sobre todo porque despeja el miedo, la intención de crear desconfianza.
The president said the National Guard will have its own facilities to avoid lodging expenses.
Entonces hay que alcanzar para tener más elementos, garantizar la seguridad pública y tener instalaciones, tener equipo, y en eso se está invirtiendo el presupuesto.
The president stressed that the ranks of the National Guard would grow to some 80,000 by the end of 2019, and that this number would increase to 120,000 in 2020. ADN 40 News.
And my colleague, Ana Maria Salazar, spoke to Bloomberg's editor-in-chief, that's John Micklethwait. He is a prominent British journalist who earlier this week had the opportunity to talk to President Andrés Manuel López Obrador. And this was the first interview that the head of state had given to an international media company, which makes it especially important. Let's take a look at what he had to say, what the president had to say, and what John was able to get out of him. Let's take a look.
John Micklethwait joins us this morning. He's editor-in-chief of Bloomberg. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You had the opportunity to interview President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, and it was a very interesting interview in terms of the views of the economy that he has for Mexico. And one of the questions I wanted to ask you in terms of, understanding how he thinks and looking towards what could potentially happen in the next year and a half. I mean, what tendencies, what events should we be following very closely here in Mexico? Because those events, those tendencies could have an impact not only on the Mexican economy, but potentially on Mexican politics.
I think in terms of things that could really affect Mexico, I think one very obviously is what happens in America, the election there.
Right. Let me ask you this. When you look, let's talk about U.S. politics and the electoral process. What are you following? What should we worry about?
I think in terms of, from a Mexican point of view, I think there is the hope that the new version of NAFTA gets passed by Congress. I'm a little bit dubious about that because I'm beginning to think that maybe the Democrats don't have that much incentive to do so. Trump seems quite keen to get this deal through. The Democrats are beginning to ask questions. Mexico seems completely ready to go for it. But north of the border, there's slightly more difficulty. And I think on top of that, you're going to get the fact that the election, immigration is going to be a big issue.
So, if immigration is going to be one of the main issues for the electoral process, what could you foresee in terms of statements made by the president or further sanctions? I mean, tariffs? I mean, what are we talking about here?
Anyone who can foresee Trump's statements is a genius. I think in terms of tariffs, I think Trump has already shown the capacity to suddenly reintroduce that as a topic. And the only bit which may be breaking him slightly is I think it was noticeable how the rest of the world reacted to what he did to Mexico. Because if you have a president who does a deal, and then the moment something else comes up, tries to renegotiate it, it makes a difference.
It seems that we're living in a new world with a different paradigm where national security issues, I mean, there was very strong attempts throughout the last decade that you could leave national security issues on one side and trade on the other side. I mean, there was really, everyone tried very hard. And that's why you had all these commercial agreements in order to kind of separate politics and security from trade. I mean, is that world over? I mean,
there has been a split. In the old days, the one thing you could guarantee about conservatives everywhere is that they were pro-free trade. Now, Trump very obviously isn't. You've got the mess of Brexit in Europe. You've got all these other different areas where these things can be really quite tough. And so the old idea that you would have the left close to unions, worried about free trade, you have the right close to business, pro-free trade, that is suddenly much more of an issue. And that is happening all the way across the world.
Well, it's interesting here, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador is in favor of trade.
Yes, things have come full circle. He used to be against...
Right.
If you think all those years ago, he was against NAFTA.
Right.
And that was quite normal for someone from his background. So was Donald Trump, and that was extraordinary. There were very few business people who were against it, which tends to show, to me at least, for Donald Trump, one of the very few things he has always believed in is some version of protectionism.
Let's talk about Brexit. You just mentioned it. I mean, how bad is it going to get? I mean, I continue to talk to analysts that seem to believe that it's not going to happen.
I think there has been a lot of people who've had their head in the sand, and they have ignored two things. One, that the ruling party in Britain at the moment is the Conservatives, and that is definitely a hard Brexit party at the moment. And the second thing is that the default option has always been a hard Brexit. Without a deal, Britain, perhaps because it insanely invoked Article 50, but it will leave on October 31st.
And the impact on Mexican economy?
I think that these sort of things make a difference. I mean, for a start, imagine Britain does jump out. You're going to have Britain suddenly coming rushing quickly to see countries. The United States is an obvious one, but so also is Mexico. They will want to do deals. They will be desperate in some ways to do deals, so that will be part of it. And there will be a difficult balance if you're Mexico. You want to have good deals with the whole of the European Union. That is worth so much more than the British. You definitely want to focus on that.
You mentioned very briefly Iran, and of course we follow the Iran negotiations or crisis between the United States and Mexico, the United States and Iran, mainly because of the price of oil.
I think the price of oil could get hit in a big way if something happens in the Straits of Hormuz, if something bad comes about. You know, at the moment that we did have a deal on Iran, which seemed to be keeping it in roughly the right zone.
John Micklethwait, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie.
And from that same organization, that is Bloomberg Business Week, I welcome Eric Martin. He is from that organization, a top-ranked comentarista and editor. How are you? Good morning.
Augustine. How are you?
Thank you for being here. So he picked up on, Micklethwait picked up on a lot of these themes. What do you think his general impressions of the president were, where he's going, and what would you highlight vis-a-vis this talk with Andrés Manuel López Obrador?
Sure. Well, I think that we covered a lot of ground in the interview. Talked about some things of great interest to Bloomberg clients in terms of investors and people in the markets about his views on the central bank, and AMLO expressing the view that he would like to see lower interest rates, yet respects the autonomy of the central bank. The interview ran for about 50 minutes, so it covered a lot of ground. Kind of the most interesting point for a U.S. audience, perhaps, was that he was very firm about we would not accept a safe third country agreement like the one that was accepted the previous week by Guatemala, and also talking about the reasons for wanting to have a good relationship with the U.S., talking about some of the historical references of having strong or nationalist presidents in both countries, Lincoln and Juarez in the 19th century, Lázaro Cárdenas, and President Roosevelt, FDR, in the 20th century, and talking about how you can have presidents who are looking out for the needs of their people, particularly seeing some parallels with FDR in terms of the social programs and spending to get the U.S. out of the Great Depression and to take care of the poorest in the population.
Right, so he comes back to these social programs as a response to these issues of immigration and all of these different things. But there was no talk of a Marshall Plan. There was no, was there reference to this? Because I mean, at the end of the day, you can reference governments. For example, Benito Juárez, he did this Tratado Maclean-Ocampo, which at the beginning of which in the middle of the 19th century was talking about how the U.S. was going to have access to the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. It wasn't passed by the U.S. Senate, and that's why it didn't come into force. But how does he see himself in that historical context, and how much do words affect the possibility of actually creating these social programs that he wants?
Well, I thought it was fascinating that President López Obrador, one of the most interesting lines I thought was he talked about having a dream that during his administration, Mexicans will no longer need to go to the U.S. for work, that they'll be proud and taken care of while staying at home. And this is part of the plan that they've tried to get the U.S. to accept in terms of both Central America and Southern Mexico for spending on development. Obviously, that's difficult at a time when President Trump has rescinded funding that had been approved for Central America, particularly $550 million.
But even out of that context, Eric, I mean, in order for that to happen, there needs to be economic growth. And in order for economic growth to happen, there needs to be private investment. You can't have the U.S. government suddenly creating growth in Central America and Southern Mexico, because there simply aren't the funds for it. I mean, when there's this break, or there's this disconnect between what is wanted and what is actually being done to create that, because the conditions don't exist. Did he ask about that?
We asked about certainly about the economy and whether he thinks Mexico is in a recession. The preliminary number that we received 2 days later showed that Mexico just skirted recession, 0.1% growth in the second quarter, which misses the traditional definition of a recession of 2 consecutive quarters of contraction, because we had that in the first quarter. But certainly talking about AMLO wanting the economy to grow 4% on average during his term, and talking about how he sees that possible if Mexico can return to the growth rates of the 1950s and 60s of 5 or 6% during the Mexican miracle. Right. Most economists would question that and would be very skeptical of that possibility. But he also talked about the idea that in his view, we need new metrics for measuring how Mexico is doing, and that growth, that GDP is not synonymous with development, and that to have development, you need both growth and a lowering of inequality, a spreading of the wealth to those who previously have not had it. And so a better distribution for him is development, and that he would prefer to measure the success of the administration on development rather than just headline growth.
So Bloomberg Businessweek has a very specific audience, right? You have a lot of people who are investors, a lot of people who actually move the money that would be necessary to generate that wealth that AMLO supposedly wants. So do you think, did John walk away impressed, or do you think that the readers of Bloomberg Businessweek are happy with the responses that the President of Mexico gave, and where do you think this is all going?
I think John's impressions in the interview that Ana Maria Salazar did with him speak for themselves. But I do think that he pressed the president on the question of confidence among business people and whether his administration is engendering that. For instance, a lot of investors and a lot of companies concerned about the oil auctions and whether there will be a renewal of that. And the president's response, as it has been in previous months, has been, yes, it's something that we could look at, but we need to see the people who have already been awarded contracts producing. People in the industry would question that, saying these contracts typically take several years to produce anything, particularly if they're deep water contracts. 4, 5, 6 years is pretty normal. Right. And so questioning the premise of what he's looking for as far as expecting production at this point, when these are contracts that really have a much longer time horizon and cycle. But I would say that that's something that the business community and investors we speak to have been concerned about will energy auctions ever be renewed, because Pemex either via joint ventures or some other way needs more capital to be exploring and producing.
Did he get the impression that the president was actually conscious of this?
It was something that the president certainly seems to be conscious of. He seems to have a response ready, certainly. And also just talking about confidence in general. We saw programs this week that the finance ministry announced actually a couple of days after our interview that they will use the rainy day oil fund to make up for a shortfall on federal government revenue, which is something that AMLO had kind of suggested to us he was leaning against on Monday. Okay. He also had meetings later on Monday with his finance ministry, but perhaps showing there some pragmatism about where we get the money from and what does it look like.
So we're going to go to a commercial break, but when we come back, we're going to continue the conversation. There's lots to talk about. As you know, we're going to have a new U.S. ambassador. That's something that we're going to discuss with Eric Martin, but please stay tuned. We'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back. We are here on ADN 40 News. So President Trump's latest threat to impose additional tariffs on China. We were just actually looking at the Popocatépetl. That was what we actually came back on. But the fact is that President Trump actually is imposing new tariffs on China, and that poses a risky downside as he heads into a contentious re-election campaign. This and more was part of the week's agenda in terms of U.S. politics and Donald John Trump. Let's take a look.
Stop that. But that's
This week, Donald Trump could not miss the second Democratic debate, which unfolded the ideological divisions gripping his rival party. When reporters asked about the event, the tycoon gave his opinion about the night.
I think that Kamala did not do well last night. I think Biden did okay. He came through. He came limping through, as I say about Sleepy Joe. He limped right through it, but he got through it. He really did. I think he was okay. I think Kamala had a bad night last night, I would say. But it's really boiling down to 4 or 5 of them, let's face it. I don't see anybody coming from there.
At the last chapter in the tense relationship between U.S. and China, Trump made a sharp escalation of a trade war among the two countries. He will impose a fresh 10% tariff in Chinese imports, which shall enter into force on September 1st.
We've taxed China on $300 billion worth of goods and products being sold into our country, and China eats it because they have to pay it, because what they do is they devalue their currency and they push money out. But in the meantime, until such time as there's a deal, we'll be taxing them.
Trump justified his decision on Twitter and also criticized China for not following through on its promises to buy more U.S. agricultural products at this week's negotiations in Beijing. The announcement caught Wall Street by surprise, and oil prices collapsed. Next month, both nations will continue negotiations in Washington, D.C. ADN 40 News.
And related to that, on Thursday, attorney Christopher Landau was confirmed as the new U.S. ambassador to Mexico. He will be filling a position that has been vacant for over a year when Roberta Jacobson, who's been on this program several times, she resigned, and that position has been open, and now we actually have confirmation that this gentleman will be the new representative of the United States in our country. Let's take a look at his profile, and then we'll talk to Eric Martin about what this all means.
Christopher Landau was born in Madrid, Spain on November 13, 1963. His father was prominent diplomat George W. Landau, who was working for the State Department at the time in Europe. Reason why his son was born abroad. Since then, Landau has lived in several Latin American countries where he gained fluency in Spanish. He's a lawyer and received his Juris Doctor magna cum laude from Harvard Law School in 1989. He also wrote his senior thesis on the United States' relations with the leftist government of Venezuela in the mid-1940s, which received the Hoops Prize. After graduating from law school, he clerked for then-Judge Clarence Thomas of the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. He later worked for Associate Justice Antonin Scala of the Supreme Court of the United States. In 1993, Landau joined Kirkland & Ellis as an associate, becoming a partner in 1995. He's currently a partner of the firm Quinn Emanuel, Urquhart & Sullivan in Washington. And in 2017, the president of the Supreme Court named Christopher Landau as member of the Judicial Conference of Advisors on Rules of Appeal. ADN 40 News.
And in order to understand what this all means, we welcome again Eric Martin from Bloomberg. Eric, so we were just discussing this, right? So he has a very curious background. Born in Spain, the guy actually speaks Spanish, which is always good. An attorney in D.C., son of a diplomat. So what's your take on all this?
Well, it's fascinating. I mean, he's somebody who has spent his career in law, has argued before the Supreme Court, as we just saw in this video, was a clerk to 2 Supreme Court justices, but at the same time somebody who is very well versed in the issues of Latin America.
By the way, very conservative Supreme Court justices.
Well, this is true, but in Republican circles, particularly in the last couple of decades, justices have a certain profile, and so I don't think that necessarily reflects his own personal politics.
Okay.
A fascinating family story that his father came to the U.S., actually first went to Colombia. He was born in Austria and was fleeing Nazi occupation of Europe. Within a few decades was representing the U.S. overseas as ambassador in Paraguay, in Chile, in Venezuela. And so although Chris doesn't have formal diplomatic experience, he grew up as the son of an ambassador over more than a decade, and also has this background of having studied the region with being bilingual. He, as I understand it, is a very fluent Spanish speaker, which has not always been the case with ambassadors in the past. So I think that he has potential to, to really connect with people in Mexico. And also, just having had this job vacant for more than a year, anybody in any embassy will tell you that there's a certain cachet that when you have somebody who is officially named by the president,
right.
that helps to give credibility really in terms of being, being an envoy and helping to facilitate the dialogue between the countries.
Yeah, as you know, I am the son of an ambassador. In this case, I grew up in similar circumstances in that respect. And what is key is what you just mentioned. There is that personal connection between the person who is named as an envoy. If they have the direct line, especially in an administration that's as personal as this one, it's the most important thing. So you think that Landau will actually have that direct line to President Trump. Do you not see that it's also sort of a trap for somebody that's that formal? Because, of course, you're going to have Mexico policy being dictated through Twitter personally by the president. Mm-hmm. So how do you think this is going to go?
Well, I think it's a challenging job, no doubt about it. We saw that with Ambassador Jacobson, that there's the possibility at any moment the president comes out and announces policy in 140 characters, and you have to adjust to that. But I think that that Ambassador Landau, somebody who's very well known in, as you mentioned, Republican political and legal circles in Washington, is somebody of the level in terms of both reputation and just recognition that potentially, is going to be, a serious, potentially serious player with the Mexican administration. And we've seen the people who had been floated or who had been talked about in the past as potential ambassadors, Tom Barrack, as well as Ed Whitaker, and so now seeing Ambassador Landau, you would think that all of those, the people have been discussed, and the final choice, who was approved on Thursday,
by the Senate,
have that credibility and backing from Washington. Otherwise, it wouldn't be worth sending someone.
I guess the question is, why would anybody want the job, right? I mean, you have the most important relationship to the United States is, of course, Mexico, because it crosses every single issue. It's called an intermestic relationship. That is, domestic policy and international policy, in the case of Mexico, completely coincide. I have my doubts. I'm a little worried that somebody who comes at this from with so much personal experience and a person who I imagine has a lot of pride in their background could actually deal with something that's as volatile as this.
Well, it's certainly a challenge, but Ambassador Landau, in his testimony to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee towards the end of May, talked about his personal connection to the region, having grown up largely here, and his family's service, his father's service, both in the U.S. Army and then later in the State Department as a career Foreign Service officer, later involved with the Council of the Americas. So a strain that runs, in a very strong way through his family of public service and of involvement in the region. And so, I think we'll need to wait and see how this all plays out. But people are excited to have an ambassador, because since Ambassador
is that the
Jacobson
feeling
left in May of last year,
the so-called Círculo Rojo, right? That you deal with, Eric. Is that the feeling that people are excited to have somebody with this profile be in that position? Are people happy?
In general, the relationship with the U.S. in this administration has gone more through the traditional institutional channels than it did with the Peña Nieto administration, in that we saw Luis Videgaray as foreign minister doing a lot of business directly with Jared Kushner. Kushner is still involved with, as an envoy and as a negotiator with the López Obrador administration, but we've seen Marcelo Ebrard meeting more often, speaking more often with Mike Pompeo. We saw the visit a few weeks ago of Secretary Pompeo to Mexico, and an acknowledgement of the efforts that Mexico has made to lower the undocumented migration numbers. So I think because 40%. Of the preference that we've seen for institutionality on behalf of Relaciones Exteriores, the ministry in Mexico, it's likely that an ambassador could have a greater role with the López Obrador administration than with the Peña Nieto administration, when Kushner, having helped arrange the visit of nominee and candidate Trump to Mexico City, and having been so involved through kind of the family of President Trump, that's something that's been a little bit less so, and through some of the more traditional channels with the new presidency in Mexico.
Well, we certainly wish newly appointed Ambassador Landau all the luck in the world. He certainly will need it. Eric Martin, thank you very much from Bloomberg Business Week for being with us.
Thank you.
Now we have Pedro Pierluisi. He was sworn in as Puerto Rico's new governor. This is all related to international news. He replaces Ricardo Rosselló, who had stepped down following weeks of protests. This and more is part of our global weekly summary. Let's take a look.
Scores of people have been killed in Nigeria in one of the deadliest attacks on civilians in recent years.
They attacked them at the graveyard.
A local official said that the victims were returning from a funeral in the northeastern Borno region when they were attacked. There was no immediate claim of responsibility, but Boko Haram and rival Islamic State in West Africa are known to attack the area. President Buhari condemned the attack in a statement and directed the military to hunt down the perpetrators. The conflicts in Borno have lasted a decade. Militants have killed thousands, and millions more have fled from their homes.
Prominent Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny's claim that he was the victim of a poisoning attempt isn't enough to get him out of jail. That's according to a Moscow court which on Tuesday turned down Navalny's appeal for early release on health grounds. He took ill in custody on Sunday and was rushed to the hospital. He's serving a month's sentence for urging people to take part in this unauthorized protest in Moscow last weekend. Navalny, his lawyer and a doctor blame an unknown chemical substance for his symptoms. It looked like an acute allergic reaction, with severe swelling of the face and skin redness. His lawyer argued he should be let out early because the cell he's locked up in was probably the source of his mystery illness. The fierce Putin critic has served several stints in jail in recent years for organising anti-government demonstrations.
44 people appeared in a Hong Kong court on Wednesday, charged with rioting for their role in this protest that turned violent when thousands of activists clashed with police near Beijing's main representative office on Sunday. It's the first time that authorities in the financial hub have resorted to using the rioting charge. It's a term that has infuriated activists, partly because of the heavier sentence it carries. Under Hong Kong law, rioting is defined as an unlawful assembly of 3 or more people, where any person commits a breach of the peace. The former British colony has plunged into its biggest political crisis since its return to Chinese rule in 1997. Protests began in late April against a controversial extradition bill, but in recent weeks they've turned more and more violent.
The United States believes that a son of al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden is dead. A U.S. official told Reuters that on Wednesday, and so far no confirmation from President Trump, who declined to comment after it was first reported by NBC News. According to the New York Times, the U.S. was involved in the operation that led to Hamza's death, which would have happened sometime in the past 2 years, details which Reuters has not verified. Only a few months ago, the State Department was offering a reward of up to $1 million for information leading to Hamza's identification. He was at his father's side in Afghanistan before the 9/11 attacks on the United States. He also spent time with his father in Pakistan after the U.S.-led invasion of Afghanistan pushed out much of al-Qaeda's senior leadership.
And one of the things that actually happened this week that we didn't pick up on, which is very important to comment, is the fact that there was this Democratic presidential candidate debate. And so we did see, I guess the big takeaway would be the fact that Joe Biden remains very much the front runner. And for Mexico, there are two people who are particularly interesting, two quote-unquote Mexicans, or at least people who have a very special connection with this country. One of them is Beto O'Rourke, who was the congressman from the border region of El Paso, somebody who is perfectly fluent in Spanish, and somebody who has actually shown enormous sympathy with respect to Mexicans at the border and Mexican plight in general. He has actually just remained at 1%. The other is, of course, Julian Castro. He's from San Antonio, a gentleman who was actually in one of the administrations, in this case the Obama administration, as Housing and Urban Development Secretary, and he is also at 1%. So these are the issues that came up during the Democratic presidential debate. We're going to go to a commercial break, but please stay tuned. When we come back, we're going to be discussing some other news that's very, very important that you're going to need this Saturday. We'll be right back. Welcome back to ADN 40 News. We're here live from our studios in Mexico City on this beautiful day in the nation's capital. We're also on Twitter at Agustin Barrios G. And I remind you, of course, that from 9 to 10 we will have our transmission en español, for which we will also have some very interesting news. Remember that a few months ago, Mexico became the first country to ratify the revamped North American Free Trade Agreement, that is the USMCA, TEMEC en español. Even though our country passed a labor law overhaul required by the United States negotiations, some Democrats have raised questions about the effectiveness of its implementation. And as a result, the trade deal still depends on President Donald Trump's mood. That is, how much he wants to push it through the House of Representatives. Canada hasn't passed the deal yet and seems to be waiting to see what the United States Congress will do next. We had the opportunity to talk to Patty Hajdu. She is the Minister of Employment, Workforce and Labour of Canada about this topic. And here is this exclusive interview for ADN 40 News. Let's take a look.
Mexico and Canada established a bilateral working committee to ensure better protections for workers in the country. In an exclusive interview for ADN 40, the Minister of Employment, Workforce and Labour of Canada, Patty Hajdu, assured that they will provide advice and technical expertise to Mexico with the implementation of its labor reform.
We have incredible mediators, for example, an entire department that does mediation and provides mediation service for unions and for employers when they're negotiating their first collective agreement, or often, as is the case in Canada, they're renegotiating a collective agreement, or there's been some sort of dispute. We also have an industrial relations board that helps solve disputes when there's a question about an agreement that hasn't been followed, or if a union files a grievance, if there's legal disputes up to and including arbitration. And those mechanisms help make sure that we can move forward together, that there's minimal labor disruption in Canada, and that in fact workers' rights are being protected in the workplace.
Canada is committed to ratifying the new trade agreement with the United States and Mexico to promote job creation with better wages and conditions, thus ensuring the continuing growth and competitiveness of the North American economy.
We believe we need to do this in partnership with the United States and with Mexico, that it is a trilateral process, that all countries have to be committed to ratifying the new NAFTA. And we believe that it's important for all countries too, because it is a job creator. Millions of jobs have been created through this. It allows the free movement of goods and services across all three countries. It allows for increased growth across all three countries. It allows for the reduction of trade irritants that we know defeats all of us in terms of our growth agenda, in terms of our agenda of creating good, stable, middle-class jobs. So it's very important to all three countries, and we're pleased that we were able to arrive at an agreement, and we look forward to all three countries doing the hard work to ratify that agreement now together.
The Canadian minister celebrated the partnership both countries have shared throughout the years and pushed to strengthen it in order to promote more labor exchange between Mexico and Canada that will help the growth of both economies.
We do have a temporary foreign worker program, as you know, as well as a seasonal agricultural worker program. And that has been a program that we've shared with Mexico for a long time, which provides opportunities for Mexicans to work in Canada, oftentimes in sectors that Canadian employers find very hard to find labor for. We will continue to work on that program and strengthen it to make sure that it's fair, that workers that come from Mexico are treated fairly, that their rights are respected in Canada.
Canada will continue to work with Mexico on adopting the best practices in labor that will benefit both workers and employers. Hugo Vela, ADN 40 News.
And from that, we go to the markets. Let's take a look at the performance of local and international markets during this past week.
Markets' risk appetite waned and stock markets around the world extended their slide as jitters over trade return and Federal Reserve announcement disappointed. Even though the monthly employment report showed that the United States continued to add jobs at a solid pace, market participants were much worried about the potential impact of a trade war ramp-up between the U.S. and China. In the United States, the S&P 500 and the Nasdaq sank 3.1% and 3.9% respectively, while the Dow Jones dropped 2.6%. In fact, the decline on Wall Street was led by technology companies. In line with a more risk-averse sentiment, the yield on the benchmark 10-year Treasury note dropped to 1,855% from 2,081% a week earlier. Elsewhere in Europe, the Stoxx 600 fell 3.2%, while markets in Asia closed with significant losses. Hong Kong's Hang Seng dropped 5.2%, and the Japanese stock market lost 2.6%. Over the course of the week, the Mexican benchmark slipped 1.7%. Besides, the Mexican peso ended the week at 1930, depreciating 1.3%. Next week, analysts in the U.S. will be focused on manufacturing data. In Mexico, market participants will closely follow inflation figures and industrial production. ADN 40 News.
And to understand more about the financial market situation, we welcome to our studio Diana Cerro. She's our in-house financial analyst, as you well know. Diana, good morning. What have you got for us?
Good morning, Agustin. Well, this week was key for global financial markets because the Federal Reserve cut rates for the first time in a decade, and it was amazing how markets reacted like in the opposite way, like if the Fed had increased the rate. So now the target rate lies between 2 and 2.25%.
So what do you mean by that?
By what?
By that reaction?
I mean that, for example, you would expect stock markets after a cut to increase, but stock markets decrease. The S&P lost like 1.7% just right after the cut.
Why?
And the Treasury bonds went up like for 9 basis points or so. And the MXN depreciated. It went from 18.95 to around 19.20.
The peso.
The peso, right. And you would expect like the opposite reaction. You would expect stock markets to increase. You would expect treasury bonds, treasury yields to decrease, and the MXN to appreciate. So that was because this was just a preventive cut, according to the Fed, and why? Because the economy is still growing at a moderate pace.
So the markets had discounted 50 basis points and they just reduced 25?
They were discounting a more dovish tone. Now, most analysts were expecting a 25 basis points cut, but everyone was expected a much dovish signal. And besides, the Federal Reserve said there are these trade wars all around the world, and they stated they were really worried about how that would impact economic growth in the world.
Okay.
So everyone was like, okay, we're now very worried, and the markets reacted in a very particular way.
And Donald Trump wanted a further rate cut, right? And he actually berated the bank.
Yes, the President of the United States has recently said that he wants rates to decrease, but everyone, the FOMC members are really cautious now, because what happens if the U.S. economy starts slowing down? They won't have any more weapons to counterattack, and so most analysts were really disappointed.
Does this mean that Mexico is finally going to be dropping its own rates?
Implied rates, and some analysts are thinking that Banxico would cut the rate twice this year. I'm not sure about that. I think it will be just one rate cut, and maybe, I mean, it's not like everything is like set or so, but Banxico's worried about, the uncertainty in the Mexican economy, and so they are not so willing to cut to cut the rate.
Diana Cerros, thank you very much for being here with us.
Thanks for having me.
And believe it or not, our production team saw fit to talk about International Beer Day at 8:30 in the morning. It's a fun date to show the appreciation for those involved in making the beverage, very popular beverage around the world, obviously, and for those who simply enjoy this drink. Let's take a look.
It's the world's most widely consumed alcoholic drink and the third most popular drink overall, just after water and tea. Yep, we're talking about beer. In fact, beer is so popular it has its own worldwide celebration day. The idea arose in a Californian small bar in the United States in 2007. Nowadays, International Beer Day is celebrated in more than 200 cities across 50 different countries. In 2018, international sales from beer exports totaled $15 billion, and Mexico ranked first among global beer exporters. Mexico is fourth in the production ranking as it manufactures 122 million liters a year. China, the United States, and Brazil are Mexico's top competitors. The states where most production takes place are Guanajuato, Hidalgo, Tlaxcala, Puebla, Mexico State, and Zacatecas. Actually, the world's largest beer factory is located in Zacatecas. Lately, craft beer consumption has skyrocketed across the country, and thus around 130 small and mid-sized enterprises have found attractive opportunities in Mexico. This industry creates more than 55,000 direct jobs and another 2.5 million indirect employments. Although an overdose is harmful to your health, if taken in limited quantities, it has countless benefits. Beer helps to strengthen our bones, balances glucose levels, reduces the risk of diabetes, and some even argue it decreases risks of getting Alzheimer's disease. ADN 40 News.
And continuing with the idea that it's 5 o'clock somewhere, then you can't miss the exhibit Under the Foam, The Mysteries of Beer at the Economics Interactive Museum in this Mexico City capital that we have here. This public showing aims to publicize the social and economic importance of this drink in our country, which actually includes, as you know, the most exported brand in the world. And the exhibit will be held downtown, that is in the historical center of Mexico City, until September 8th. And for further details, you can actually visit mide, that's mide.org.mx. And now we actually have with us, we're coming to the end of this particular hour, we have with us, as always, Gabriel Hernandez, known as El Faraón. He has all the information related to showbiz. Take it away, Gabriel.
Good morning, everybody. You know, Avengers Endgame is still ringing the bell in terms of success in film history. But it is not the only thing is happening with this film. You know, there's a lot of things coming out, so let's watch this story and let's find out.
It's not about how much we lost. It's about how much we have left.
Disney succeeded in making Avengers Endgame the biggest selling movie of all time. But things didn't always go to plan on set. Walt Disney Studios Home Entertainment released a blooper reel earlier this week as an extra feature on its home video version of the superhero movie.
Hamstring. Warm your butt cheeks up. Warm up your butt cheeks.
Cut there. Copy that.
There you go.
The reel sees some of the well-known faces fluffing lines, falling over, or complaining about their costumes.
I can't believe I made a whole movie with this thing on.
Yeah, does it look cool or... Doesn't feel cool, but if it looks cool, that's what matters.
This footage will be available on the home video devices of Avengers Endgame, at August 13 worldwide.
Do you have any idea what's coursing through my veins right now? Funyuns? Yes.
Gabriel Hernández, ADN 40 News.
A duck!
This is what we have in Pop this morning. I hope you guys have a wonderful Saturday and be peace.
Thank you very much, Gabriel Hernandez, as always, with the top entertainment news. Some really funny bloopers on that one. We're going to be actually finishing up this hour of news in English from 8 to 9, like every Saturday. We have this segment, and then when we come back, we're going to be talking about all of these issues, but in Espanol, and we're going to be picking up on a lot of the things that are coming up. As you know, the summer is coming to a close, so kids are coming back. Traffic is going to be a little bit light. We had a couple of the images from the Popocatépetl, which had some exhalations today. And here in Mexico City, we actually did have a strange little event that we've been having every now and then with these small earthquakes, a 2.3 that actually was right in the heart of the most populated area of the city, that is in Álvaro Obregón. That took place last night at 11 p.m. I actually felt it. We're going to have to be following up on that. Hopefully we won't have any breaking news on that front. But when we actually come back, we're going to be closing with a live image of the Popocatépetl. And when we come back, cuando regresemos en español, no se vayan después de estos mensajes.